It is my pleasure to welcome you to American University's Spring 2022 Israeli Writer Series. My name is Michael Brenner, and I'm the director of the Center for Israel Studies here at American University, actually the first center of its kind in the United States, inaugurated by the late Shimon Peres in 1998. I would like to thank my colleague Lauren Strauss for organizing this series as part of her class on Voices of Modern Jewish Literature, and Laura Cutler, our managing director, for all the work that went into making this happen. Our first speaker in the series is David Grossman, who needs not much of an introduction. Born in Jerusalem in 1954, he has been wrestling with the trauma of war and the prospects for peace, as well as love, jealousy, and family relationships in his writings for more than 3 decades. In his first novel, Sea Under Love, he grappled with the legacy of the Holocaust. In The Yellow Wind, he foresaw the explosive First Intifada, and in his best-selling To the End of the Land, he hauntingly portrayed a mother's love for her son in a time of conflict. Today, he will speak, among other topics, on his latest novel, More Than I Love My Life, published internationally in 2020-2021 to some of his best reviews ever. Grossman's 19 books have been translated into 45 languages around the world. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, and several of his books have been adapted to international stage and screen productions. The musical oratorium based on Falling Out of Time is scheduled to premiere at Carnegie Hall in May 2022, almost next month. Germany's most respected newspaper, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, recently wrote, David Grossman is simply the greatest living novelist. Among many other honors and awards, Grossman was the winner of the 2017 Man Booker International Prize for A Horse Walks Into a Bar and the 2018 Israel Prize, considered to be the state's highest honor. His latest book is again nominated for the Man Booker Prize. So it is my pleasure to speak with you again, David, after our last conversation in Munich a few months ago, unfortunately only over Zoom. And I should say that we hope to have you back on campus, of course, at the next possible occasion. We agreed to have this event in form of a conversation for about 40 minutes and then open it up to questions from the audience for another 15 minutes or so. And let us begin with your last novel. In Hebrew, it is called Iti Chaim Mesachek Harbe, which literally means, with me, life plays around a lot. In English, it is called More Than I Love My Life. We can tell already from the title that translation is also and always interpretation. But more than that, every history writing is, of course, interpretation. And I say this as a historian, and of course it is very true for novelists. And this last novel is actually something like a historical novel, I would say. It is based on the real lives of Yugoslav partisans, and the main protagonist in the book is someone you knew personally, and who also has been depicted in a documentary movie. It is, in my view, first and foremost, a dramatic, often disturbing story about a relation between a mother and a daughter, but it's also a story about Stalinism and Titoism, about Yugoslavia, a country that does not even exist anymore. And so often, there's, of course, also the Shoah in the background. So my first question to you is actually, how did you come to choose this topic, which is a quite bit unusual for those who know your novels?
Shalom, Michael. Shalom to everyone who is watching us now. Good evening. It's evening here, dark. Thank you for the nice, warm things that you said, welcoming me. I'm glad to be there, even digitally and hopefully in person sometime. How did I find this story? The story found me actually, because one day the phone rang and there was this lady with a very decisive, authoritative, but yet very sweet voice. Eva Panich Nahir was her name, Eva Panich Nahir. And she approached me because she had a remark regarding something I said the other day. She thought I should have been more tough about the settlers or something like that. But very quickly, the conversation turned to another direction because I was fascinated by her accent, which was a very unusual accent. It was a mixture of Serbian, Croatian, Hungarian, and Hebrew. And I asked her, where did she come from? And she started to tell me her story, and she spoke, and the story unfolded, and it was a fascinating story. But then at a certain point, she stopped. And she said, well, David, you know, I don't want to burden you with my little story. Maybe sometime in the future, I'll call you and we shall continue our conversation. And I said, okay, but don't wait too long. And I think 3 days later, the future came and she called me again. And we continued the conversation. And again, at the most critical point, she stopped and she said, I don't want to bore you with my little story. But then I already recognized the pattern of Scheherazade, you know, not to tell the story until the end, so the Sultan will keep her alive for one more night. So I said, no, I really want to hear your story. And she said, will you write my story? And I said, you know, Eva, I cannot tell you now. Usually it takes me time to decide which story from the stories that I think of will be written. It should be inevitable story, a story that I must write, and still I don't know everything about your story. But one thing I can tell you, I told her, I am not a documentarist. I will not write you exactly as you are, one-to-one. I must invent you and imagine you and fantasize you. I can promise you, I told her, that I will not impose on you anecdotes or stories or facts that are not agreeing with your character, with your potential character. But I will have to invent things. And she said, of course, yes, this is your right as a writer, as a poet, the licencia poetica. And so we started our friendship that lasted for 20 years. She died at the age of 97. Unfortunately, didn't live enough to read the book. It was not written yet. And I want to believe that she would have liked it had she read it, because I didn't try to beautify her or to idealize her. I wrote her as she was, and that was enough because she's such an extreme and inner contradictory person, and so many layers of personality there are there that it was really great to try to document and to invent her.
So that was over a long time. I didn't realize you've known her for so long. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this process of how do you actually build your characters in a novel like that or other novels?
Well, this novel was unique because the character was based on a real person, flesh and blood person, and it was hard to change some of the things that imposed themselves on me. But usually it takes me time until I'm able to understand a character from within, and it has to start with the physical dimension of every character. I need to know how she walks and how she talks and how is her hair curled, and does she talk with her hands when she speaks? What's her temperature, her mental temperature, her voltage, so to say. I remember years ago, I was writing a book that later became Someone to Run With. And for some months I was stuck because I didn't know the character. I didn't know how does she look, the character of Tamar, this young lady of 16, 15, and I didn't have her. And since I did not have her, I was unable to proceed. And I walked in the world like, like a hunter, hungry to get a clue. And one thing that I like about writing is that when you write, all the world throws clues and hints into your face, and you have to be alert enough to decode them, to catch them, and then to decode them. And one day I entered the store of the computers equipment in a mall nearby my home in מבשרת Zion. And suddenly there was this girl standing. I saw her only, let's say with the camera, was from here. And I saw only this part, her jaw, part of her mouth, her hair, the way she dressed. There was a mixture of something tough and soft at the same time about her. And I looked at her and I knew this is my Tamar. And I remember I ran out of the store. I flew out because I didn't want to have her voice, because her voice I already had in my mind. And since I knew her, it was easy to start giving her ideas and biography and anecdotes. But it has to start from the body. And then it has to be, the process is like that I give myself away to it. It reminds me of another story, and excuse me if you heard me saying this story, telling this story, but it's so typical. When I wrote To the End of the Land, it's about a woman, Ora, who is 50 years old, Israeli, and she's the main core, not only character, but the core of the book. And I was unable to write her. I felt I'm unable to know her, almost in the biblical sense of it, to really prevail in her. And I wrote the book for more than 2 years, and I just did not have Ora. And I was about to give up the book because I said, if I don't have her, I cannot continue. I do not really feel the vibrations of her and of the story. And then out of despair, sheer despair, I sat and wrote her a letter, not a mail, but a letter with pen and paper and an envelope. And I wrote, "Dear Ora, why are you like that? Why don't you surrender to me at last?" And then when I wrote this stupid thing, I thought, wow, really, how stupid I am, because it's not she who has to surrender to me. It is me who has to surrender to her option inside me, to the option of this specific Ora, to the option of a woman inside me. And once I formulated it in that way, the story started to flow, because then I knew I don't have to be so entrenched. I just have to give myself away and to benefit from this abandoning of myself. So this is the usual process, except writing the letter, that I have almost with every significant character. I come to the point where I feel that if I just let go now, I will know this character. I will become this character. And when it happens, it's really wonderful. There are some moments like that in every novel that suddenly the way is open to you, and you can just be this character, even when this character is totally contradictory to myself. You know, it can be a commander of a Nazi commander of extermination camp. It's quite painful to be able to identify with someone like that from within. The most terrible experience of writing that I ever had was when I wrote such a character in Sea Under Love. And yet, as a writer, I want to be able to understand how a normal human being becomes a Nazi or a monster. So with every character, there is this moment of miracle that they open up.
I think it's fascinating to hear that, because also we as readers, in a certain way, become part of the story, and also try to in some way identify with the different characters from a different, it's maybe a mirrored view, I don't know how to put it, but I think it's fascinating also for our students to hear this. And I should say we have our American University students, and I also want to welcome the students from Michigan State University who are joining us today. And I want to talk a bit more about the role of the storyteller in your, especially in this novel. It's very, but in many of your novels, what the storyteller always influences the reader to a certain way. maybe even manipulates the reader. Maybe it's even setting a trap. And I wonder, in this role, where it's actually, we're talking also about a female storyteller, how can you tell a little bit more about the role of the storyteller?
Yeah, I'll try. Yes, in this book, More Than I Love My Life, there are actually three storytellers, three strong women who tell the story of their wound, of the wound that goes from generation to generation in this family. But as you said, almost in every novel that I've written, there is someone who is telling a story, significant story, to a listener. And if the listener is good, he or she can be a midwife for a change, a great deep change in the life of the teller of the story. And I thought that, every one of us, we have our legislative primal story, usually about our childhood, about how we have been misunderstood or not being seen by others, being insulted by others. And over the years, we learned to tell this story better and better, and we submit it to every new person who is significant to us, and we want to gain his or her sympathy, mercy sometimes, attraction, love, whatever. And we tell this story so brilliantly. We are such good actors of our formal story that we are all the time on the edge of the danger to become prisoners of our legislated story. Because we do not really check ourselves and see maybe things have changed since we were so miserable, so overlooked, so terrified, so rejected. Maybe we are much stronger now. Maybe we can allow ourselves to be much more generous with ourselves, with others. Maybe we can read the text of our reality in more merciful eyes and see that we are now in a different place. We do not have to be totally trapped by our legislative story. Maybe, for example, we can understand that also Mama had a mama. Maybe also Mama had a mama, and she has her reasons to behave the way she does or did. And also Papa has the right to have a psychology. It's not only us, the sophisticated people, but also our parents and sometimes our grandparents. They have the right for psychology. And if we come with such openness to the text of our life, suddenly we can be, not always, but sometimes we can be liberated. We can understand that we want to be in another place in this life, in our reality, that we want to change basic conditions of our life. And by the way, I'm talking about individuals, but it applies also to nations, because every nation has to have a formal story, a mythological story, or stories that will describe the beginning of this nation and how it became a nation, and a story about her heroes and her great wars and all that. And the nation not necessarily recognized to what extent it has been trapped by these stories that would not allow her to be more flexible, for example, regarding her enemies. Maybe if a nation allows the narrative is a word that I hate, by the way. Narrative is for me a human story that has congealed and then should be massaged so it will become a human story again. But if we allow the story of our enemy to infiltrate into our own story, it will not ruin anything in the way we see ourselves. It will not minimize our identity or our affinity to our country and to our people. Not at all. It will only make our attitude more complicated, more multi-layered, more touching life, and not only the wishful thinking of our life or the nightmare that we fear from. It will allow us to be in touch with ourselves, with our enemy, with our reality. And this might be the first step to reconciliation.
Speaking about the national story, of course, you're known as a political writer, although often there were two parts of your writings, the novels and then the political texts and speeches. But I think there is something also very political, of course, in this last book. Would you like to talk about this for a moment?
Yes, there is something political because it tells about a political reality that was horrible, the reality of Yugoslavia of the 40s and 50s, the reality of the re-education camps that Tito created all over Yugoslavia, and very few people know about it, and very few people, even if they know, they don't want to talk about it. Tito was very appreciated and liked in the West because he was an open-minded communist. But actually, he did some horrible things, and the camps that he created were worse than what the Nazis did sometime. And it's not my testimony; it's the testimony of people who were sent to Auschwitz in the beginning of the 40s, came back from Auschwitz, and was sent again by Tito to those concentration camps. And they said that in Auschwitz it was easier because you knew who is the good guy and who is the bad guy. And in the camps of Tito, everyone was the enemy. Everyone was able to betray you just like that without thinking of. And there was a really a vicious, bad, evil mechanism there. And my story, part of it is of how someone like Eva Panichna here, in my book, she's called Vera, how was she able to survive life in such horrible reality? What kept her alive? What keeps us alive when we are under an arbitrary regime that wants to deprive us of our intimacy, our names, our secrets, our talents, our love? How can we remain ourselves? What is the last point in which we still are ourselves? And she remained herself. That was unbelievable. This very tiny person, tiny lady, she all the time boasted that she is no more than 40 kilos. How was she able to roll a huge rock against the slope of a hill, for example? And I asked her because I visited the island where she was imprisoned, the Goli Otok Island. I visited it after she died. And I looked at those rocks and I thought, no one can do it. And when I asked her, how were you able to do it? And she said, I told myself a story. And the ear of the writer immediately was alert. I said, what kind of story? And she said, I thought of my daughter, Tiana. And I said to myself, Tiana is sick and I must bring her a medication. And the medication can be found only in a pharmacy on the top of this hill. And first I have to roll this rock in order to get there. And so this is the story I told myself, she says, throughout rolling the stone, the rock against the slope. And there was the pharmacy, and the pharmacist gave her the medication, and she rolled the rock down, and all the way from the beginning, again and again and again, for 12 hours a day. So to think of how one can keep herself in such reality, this is a political research. And I'm attracted to write about people who are trapped under arbitrariness and how they maintain their humanity and their face, their being. But maybe there is another political point in this book, and this is at the moment when Gili is the granddaughter of Eva Panichna here, of Vera, and the daughter of Nina, who abandoned Gili when Gili was 3.5 years old. And Gili hates her mother with all her heart. But then when they are traveling, the three women traveling to the island of Goli Otok, and Gili is all the time shooting with a video camera, shooting all the participants because she tries to understand something she was unable to understand beforehand. And suddenly she sees her mother as an old woman, vulnerable, broken, miserable. And for a second, she doesn't feel hatred towards her. and it frightens her. She said, how come I do not hate Nina? Is it possible? And then she says, but who am I without the hatred to Nina? And I think when she says that, she formulates something, who are we without the hatred to the Palestinians, for example? Who are the Palestinians without hating us? All our national and sometimes personal structure was created around this hatred. So many sub-qualities emerged from this hatred. Sometimes I think we do not have peace, we and the Palestinians, because we are so much talented in fighting. We are so efficient, such experts in being soldiers, that we forget that there is really another way possible, another option for us. We do not believe that there is another option. We think that in every place on earth, when people are having values like tolerance, democracy, when people are fighting racism and hatred and all this, they live in an illusion. It cannot be true. So thinks or sub-thinks the average Israeli and the average Palestinian. And this is one of the major reasons why we are not able really to get into a situation of dialogue and of peace with each other.
David, do you think writing fiction can build bridges between different people and different peoples?
Yes, not as much as I would have loved it to be, but I think literature can reformulate situations, human situations. It can stress some nuances that were overlooked otherwise. It describes the enemy in a humane way. It gives your enemy a humane existence, and this is already the first step towards improving the situation. Literature can use words that have not been used before, and the usage of these words can open something in the mind of the people, and they might feel that they have been manipulated by big systems that have interest in the ongoing of the frozen situation. So often we see how the citizens of this conflict, of the Middle East conflict, how out of despair even of the despair of understanding what's going on, they just withdraw inwardly, and they create a vacuum, an emptiness between themselves and the situation, and between themselves and between what is being done on their behalf by the government, by the military, by the media sometimes. And this vacuum never remains empty, because immediately there will be elements and organizations and parties that have an interest in the ongoing of the situation, because the ongoing of the situation means the deterioration of the situation and the growing of hatred, and the temptation to use the language that is imposed on us by those big systems, and not insist on using our intuitive language.
Yeah, I'm sure that happened. I don't know if you had examples of people who came to you and told you that your writing, other writings influenced their way of looking to life or the conflict. But interestingly, of course, this last book really doesn't, at least on the surface, does not deal much with Israel. And I also wondered a little bit if maybe for you it was also a break from writing about the burning issues in Israel, about the existential threats, also the occupation, but of course also your personal trauma, having lost a son in one of Israel's war. Was it kind of taking a break from Israel? I mean, it wasn't an easy topic you choose, but
yeah, a better way for escapism, yeah. Yes. No, I didn't want to run away from Israel with all what Israel can suggest, from the best things to the worst things. I was only taken totally by her story, by the extremity of the story, by this character with all her inner contradictions. And I just felt I want to write this book, even more than that. The book became inevitable. At a certain point, it became inevitable. I wanted to write it, and I knew that I will understand myself better after I have written it. And at the time when I was writing it, of course, I wrote essays and articles for the papers and speeches and everything, because the situation is unbearable, and the situation never stops, only aggravates. But I think the center of my core was in the novel. It's always like that. I prefer writing novels to nonfiction. I like the energies of inventing, of seeing a world come alive suddenly, and a world that comes alive and doesn't need you anymore. You know, there is this wonderful point where you take 2 steps back like a painter from the canvas, and you look at the story that you wrote, and it works brilliantly without me. It doesn't need me anymore. This is the moment to stop writing, of course, yes, otherwise you will override. But there are some wonderful moments in the process of writing. I think the pheromones that is pouring in the brain when you write a good sentence, a true sentence, maybe this is the drug that makes people write for years and years without Shabbat, without holidays, without vacations.
I'm not writing fiction, but even as a history writer, I think we know these feelings as well, and I can very much understand what you're saying. Let me switch the topic slightly. You're writing, of course, in Hebrew, an ancient language, but also language used for modern conversation. And the language, literature, the modern literature, which goes only back about 150 years. And I wanted to ask you, what does it mean for you to write in Hebrew, and maybe also to express some kind of national identity through this language? And maybe you can even read a passage of your novel in Hebrew to us, to get us all familiar with the sound.
Good. I thought you will never ask. I will read just for a minute. I love to read in Hebrew wherever I am in the world, to have the language echo somewhere. So I'll read from the very beginning of the last book. רפאל היה בן 15 כשמתה אימא שלו וגאלה אותו מייסוריה. גשם ירד על חברי הקיבוץ שהצטופפו תחת מטריות בבית הקברות הקטן. טוביה, אביו של רפאל, מרר בבכי. שנים טיפל באשתו במסירות, ועכשיו נראה אבוד ומיותם. רפאל, במכנסיים קצרים, עמד נבדל מהאחרים וכיסה את ראשו ואת עיניו בקפוצ'ון, שלא יראו שהוא לא בוכה. הוא חשב, עכשיו שהיא מתה, היא יכולה לראות את כל הדברים שחשבתי עליה. זה היה בחורף 1962. אחרי שנה פגש אבא שלו את ורה נובק, שבאה לארץ מיוגוסלביה, והם התחילו לחיות כזוג. ורה הגיעה לישראל עם ביתה היחידה, נינה, נערה בת 17, גבוהה ובהירת שיער, שבפנים הארוכות שלה, שהיו חברות ויפות מאוד, כמעט לא הייתה הבאה. The Hebrew counts back something like 3,500 years, maybe more. I think it's very special to write in such an old language, an old new language, with all the layers, with all the memories that it has accumulated over the years and loaded some of the words with. Sometimes I think that had Abraham the patriarch, Avraham Avinu, to sit with us to the dinner table, he would have been able to understand at least half of the conversation of my 7-year-old granddaughter, which I think is something very special, to have this sequence of identity, and to be able to take this language on the face of it seems so serious. The Bible was written in it. And to show how playful it can be and how sensual and sexual it can be, and how the game, the play between the different layers of this language, how they can enrich the conversation and how can they reach the literature that is written there. For the last 31 years, I have, it is called in Hebrew, chavruta. How would you translate chavruta?
It's hard to translate. A reading discussion group or?
A reading discussion group. Okay, I'll adopt that. There is a woman, Rivka Miriam, the poetess, one of the greatest poetess of our time, I think. And my dear friend Yehuda Ben Dor, who is an educator, and myself. And for 31 years, we meet every week, once a week for 3 or 4 hours, and we read parts from the Bible. And sometimes in the summer vacations, we read Jewish writers like Kafka, Bruno Schulz, or Bialik, like we do now. And it's amazing to see how we are still connected to the origins of this language, and how it's still present in our everyday life, and how so many people who are not even knowing that they are using the biblical formulation for something, but because they went with their parents to the prayer in the synagogue, because the Hebrew is in the air now. They speak a language that can be very, very ancient, and they tell with this ancient language, they tell about a very modern and updated reality. And what I'm really sad of is the infiltration of the English in such a total massive way into the Hebrew. I'm not a Puritan about that. I think there should be a kind of a go-between or a kind of a mixture of many languages possible. But you see how the English almost taking over so many descriptions and so many parts of our dialogue. This is painful because I think it will have an influence. It will reduce the Hebrew of next generations, and it's a pity. It's a kind of a national treasure, this language.
Yeah. And my last question, and before we go to the audience, you mentioned your 7-year-old granddaughter. You also write children's books, as actually many Israeli writers of, novelists and others write children's literature. And I wanted to ask you what that means for you and how important it is for you.
Important. Always after I finish a novel for grown-ups, I need to write something optimistic and lighter, even though the life of a child are not so light as we want to believe. I wrote, I think, 19 or 20 books for children, enjoying it very much. And even more than that, I think that there is something very special about the ceremony of putting the child to sleep and reading him or her a story. And I always try to convince parents, not only to put the iPad in the hand of the child and leave him or her and going to do other things, but be with them. It can be a wonderful hour. Usually in the time of the day, there is always some tension between the parents and the children, and the demands of each side and the bargaining about things. And suddenly you have this place, the good night story bubble, I call it, where the parent and the child can meet in another way. For example, in the stories for children, there can be some absurdities or surrealism that the child meets only in these books, or a certain sense of humor that maybe is not very known in the home of the child, or the usage of some words that are like stars flickering in the darkness of the room after the parent has left. and the child does not necessarily understand all words. I like in every book of mine to leave one or two words that are like a mystery. They are exotic. I remember myself as a child, my father who read to me asked me, do you understand what this means? And I said, I don't want to know. Because I needed this exotic desire to decode it by myself. And I always remember that the night is a very frightening time in the day for a child. The night is the dreams and the nightmares. And suddenly, after a certain age, a child understands that his father or mother cannot penetrate his dream and save him from a nightmare, that he's alone there. And the night is the strange shadows and things look differently. And the child hears his parents and maybe his siblings, his brothers and sisters, yes, continue to do their things while he or she are alone in bed in the darkness. And maybe the child gets a glimpse of how life was before he has arrived. And maybe without knowing it, of course, without formulating it, he also gets the horrifying thought of how was life without him, how life might be without him, God forbid, I say. It's, it reminds me when our eldest son, Jonathan, when he was 3 years old, I once put him to bed. I finished reading him the story. And I said, Jonathan, today is the longest night of the year. It was the 21st of December. And I covered him and kissed him goodnight and went to do my things. And in the morning, I think at 5 o'clock in the morning, he bursted into our room and he was all sweaty and all excited and stormed. And he shouted, Daddy, Mommy, it's over. This night is over. Because he was like the first Adam on earth. He did not know, he was not able to be sure that the sun will rise again. We adults, congealed children as we are, we know because we read some books and we have some experience and we know that science tells us that the sun will rise tomorrow, hopefully. But the child cannot benefit from such experience. The child is tabula rasa, and all his fears are tabula rasa. And when I write for children, I aim myself to be at this very point, this throbbing point where the sun might or might not rise again.
And I know what you're talking about, having read some of your children's books to my daughter. And it is really one of, I must admit, some of my favorite of your books are also children's books, and I recommend it. I don't know how many of them are translated into English, but let me go, and we don't have that much time, so I want to go and ask some of the questions. And I also apologize, I cannot read all of the questions coming in. Here is one, Mark Bernstein. He says he had heard you say many years ago that although life in Israel can be and is often very hard, and in fact, you referred to the fact that being in military service and reserve service meant for you having at least written 2 less novels in your life, that you would not consider living anywhere else, that you want to live your story. So that's the question, if that's still the case, that you cannot imagine to live somewhere else.
Yeah, it's the same. There are many things I criticize in Israel, and yet I see the good things that still are in our society. I think I see the miracle of having a state at all. In the Mishnah, it's written, Baal HaNes eino makir beniso, the one who a miracle has happened to him, not necessarily recognize it as a miracle, but I do recognize the fact that we have a state. I would like it to be a different state. I would like it to be much more democratic. I think being an occupier for 55 years diminish your right even to be called a democracy. And there are many things that I would like to see changing, and everything, or many things might start to change only when we have peace with the Palestinians. But I want to live here because here everything is relevant for me. The things that I like, the things that I don't like, they are relevant. They are made of my materials and I'm made of their materials. And I want to live my life because life is very short. As I'm sorry to give this spoiler to you at this point, but life is short. And I want to live this short life in a relevant place, a place that means to me that I'm painful because of what happens here, and I'm shameful sometimes, and I'm also joyous and happy when I see them happening in my country.
Yeah. So there are a few questions also about what is going on today. And of course, maybe we cannot just close our eyes and exclude it from this discussion as well in Ukraine. And I remember, I think we talked about this briefly after our last conversation, that both of our fathers are from Galicia, if I remember correctly, yours also. And so that's pretty close to what is going on in Ukraine today. And some of the questions in the chat ask about, if you want to comment, and also how it may relate to Israel today.
Yes, of course, I'm glad for the question. And how can you have any serious talk today without mentioning what's going on there? It's in a way, in one aspect, it's like an old-fashioned war, because there are the good guys and the bad guys, and it's very clear this time. You know, you cannot justify what Mr. Putin is doing and not give him excuses for what he does, because he really is now sheer evil. And the things he is doing are just unbearable and unacceptable. And in the beginning, I felt that United States and the West were reluctant to use their power because of this, the lesson from in Europe, the lesson from the Second World War, that make any usage of a weapon to be unacceptable. But at a certain moment, I think most countries understood that they have really to fight Russia and to fight it economically, and to recognize Mr. Putin as the evil guy in this drama. And I'm very glad that after some hesitations, Israel at last did what one should do, and this is, you know, saving as many people as possible, open the doors of Israel to as many as possible refugees from Ukraine. We are a people of refugees. We have been created as a people when we were refugees, and most of our life we spent in a kind of an exile, and we know what that means. We know what does it mean to be uprooted. We know what it means to lose your home, the most precious thing, to lose a home, to be wandering in the world. And we have, in such a situation, we have to be, without any hesitations, without considering our national or economic interest or whatever. There are no interests in such situation. Just save people. And if one can save even one person, it's a great thing. And I look every day at the television, and my heart really is broken to see the brutality and the cruelty of the Russian troops and the way they treat civilians. And I don't know where it's all leading to. I'm sure the world will be different from now on. It will not be the old, not always good, but better world that we have experienced in the last 30 or 35 years. It will be an unpredictable world, and I'm afraid not very welcoming place to live in.
Yeah, that's after talking about children's books before, that's such a tough message to give to our children and grandchildren. I have a few questions actually about the last book and about the role of writing it from a perspective of a female voice, of a woman. And Mike Aronoff, for example, says, how do you explain the empathy you can have? And another question is about the role of a male writer taking on this female role.
Well, I think I answered it before when I told about Aura and how I understood that I just have to let go. I just have to surrender to this character. And in this book, it was not easy because there are, as I said, 3 women. Each of them is very special in her own way. Each of them has her language and inner grammar, and they have very complicated relationship with each other. And I wanted to give voice to each and every one of them. And I can just say it was quite a challenging book to write. But I wish that every book of mine, every book that I will write will be as challenging as that.
I think it is, and I say this to everyone who hasn't read it yet, a very rewarding book to read because on so many levels. And one of them, of course, is also for me as a historian, a part of history so much forgotten, but another one is just the individual human relations story. I have a question from my colleague Lawrence Strauss, who organizes this class and series, and she says, she asks about the place of your literature within modern Hebrew writers. Do you see yourself as being a link in a chain of Jewish writers? And if so, do you have a special responsibility that non-Jewish writers might not have?
First, yes, I am part of this chain of writers who wrote in Hebrew, who write in Hebrew. I don't know if I belong to a certain generation because I feel close to people who are much older than me and people who are much younger than me. There is what I like about literature, there is a full democracy about it. And Lauren asked if I feel a kind of responsibility, but I don't like to think of myself writing from a point of responsibility. My only responsibility, as I see it, is to write a good story. And on that, we can add all kind of layers. But I do not feel, I feel more than responsibility. I feel pleasure to be able and to be privileged to write in a language that counts back, as we said, almost 4,000 years ago. So it's not real responsibility. I hesitate you here because responsibility sounds too serious, and I like the playfulness of the language and the inner games between different layers of the Hebrew and the flexibility of it. So yes, the responsibility is only to write a good story.
Here's a question I like, very short. What do you read for inspiration?
I read a lot. I mean, I'm privileged because almost every book that is written in Hebrew eventually gets into this house. I cannot read all the plenty that I get, but I read everything, but mainly fiction. I'm not a reader of non-fiction. I read fiction. I love literature that is being written here because it allows me to understand things that I do not understand. There are many translations into Hebrew. Or Israel is a very translating country, unlike, by the way, the States. I think only 3% of the literature published in America comes from translation. In Israel, I think it's something like 50 or 60% of translated books.
Yes, and there is a last question, which also appears in different forms. How can you explain the difficulties people have in giving up hate? This hate has meaning for them. Can that meaning be given up?
Hate gives, let's say, hate gives you some justification for what you do, and hate sustains you and makes you feel honest and justful It makes the world more easy to decode because there is this dichotomy of the good against the bad. In order to hate, you don't have to make too much effort. It's very easy to hate. We are all born with some territorial instincts, some suspicion regarding others, especially regarding strangers. There is something almost natural in attitude that is more belligerent. In order to be more sympathetic and empathetic, you have to make a kind of a mental effort. You have to overcome some of your fears. You have to overcome some of your instincts even. It's not comfortable. If you want to stop hating and adhere to empathy, I'm not talking even about love, you have to have the ability to hold together contradictions. For example, to think that some of what the Palestinians are doing is horrible, and yet you know that you have to fight for their sovereignty and independent country, and you know that once they will live in better life condition, when they will not be oppressed and crushed, things in their life will be different. They will not have to hate you, as you will not have to hate them.
Thank you, David, so much. I would even say that reading you and even now listening to you is a bit like medicine against hate. And I do hope that your books find many readers. I can very much, as I said, recommend the last one for those who haven't. It just came out in English recently. And I'm very excited for you to see also one of your productions in a musical form in Carnegie Hall coming up. So good luck with this. And thank you so much for giving us an hour with you. I do hope we will see you in person here. And for our listeners, I also would like to point out that we have another Israeli writer, a young writer, Rutu Modan, with us coming up on Monday, and you can find all of this on our website of the Center for Israel Studies. Thank you very much. Good night, Laila Tov to Israel, and still a good day to everyone here in the United States and around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the conversation, Michael. See you soon.
See you soon.
And thank to all the people who were watching us. Laila Tov, good night.